The first line in Sri Lankan foreign policy they teach is India is your big neighbor, right? And every other policy lines has to you have to remember what the first line is.
There has been in India a foreign policy approach that has been quite macho in quotes, which is the big brother syndrome, which is that this used to be an Akhand Bharat, everybody used to be part of India. We're going to tell you like it is.
The rise of Anukumara Disanayakas it already started, but it really took off since the economic crisis. What they did was they really started mobilizing people on the grassroots level, and they did door-to-door campaigning in most parts of Sri Lanka, saying what would their difference be.
This is how we felt when Kejriwal was elected. I really hope this turns out much better than Kejriwal. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the India Dialogue. I'm so grateful you're here. I think we're at episode 30. I think. We've been doing this since before the Indian elections, and we continue to unpack issues that matter on current affairs in India. If you can see all the guests here, I'm joined by my co-host, as always, Mitali, who is an author of the book Crypto Crimes, famous for her time at CNBC, currently the acting director at the Reuters Institute at Oxford. I am Ruchir. I'm the chair at School of Policy and Governance and CEO at Distributed Energy. And the special guest today, highly recommended by a few of our friends, is Benislos Thushan, who is an attorney in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka and founder and strategist at Digital Storytelling. Benislos' presence should indicate to you what we're going to talk about, the recent Sri Lankan elections. I will let Mitali take us and set us up for today's conversation. Mitali.
Thank you, Ruchir. And just to mention for those who've sort of heard us through the last few episodes, we're missing our third pillar today, Manu Raj, who probably would have had the most perspective around this discussion. So, Benislos, it's sort of you're starting with the rookies, both Ruchir and I. But I think it's really important, as Ruchir mentioned earlier, because a lot of what we discuss is about India, but it's also about the critical touch points for India, and its neighborhood certainly is a large and critical touch point. We have been through the past few podcasts, if you've been listening to them, sort of talking quite deeply about India's foreign policy and its relations with some of its immediate neighbors. And Sri Lanka is top of mind because there have been a lot of really, really interesting developments over the last month and a half, I want to say. I think it starts with, or we set the scene for the 21st of September, which was a really big day for people in Sri Lanka. They came out, they voted in the first presidential elections since the mass protest that you may remember from 2022. And those visuals are sort of fresh, I think, in many people's minds on what was happening across the island. It was historic, the first time, I think, in Sri Lanka's history that there was a second round of counting. And then it was even more dramatic in terms of who then emerged as the winning candidate, Anurag Kumara Disanayake, who did not, represent the two major political parties that I think have had for decades now sway over Sri Lankan politics. This is the main story. There is a backdrop which is about economic distress, which is about economic decisions. And I think for the neighborhood, there's probably larger lessons for what countries like India can take from all these developments. So, Benislos, I hope I've sort of set the scene of what you've been witnessing for the last month and a half. But why don't you walk us through, the days ahead of that vote and what the mood was in Sri Lanka and what was really going on the ground when people were making this decision to see big political change?
First of all, I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you guys for having me
The pleasure
as
is
part
all
of the India Dialogue podcast. And I myself, being a rookie, I'm really excited to have a conversation and to really explore this topic together with you. And Yes, Sri Lanka has had its presidential election, the long-awaited election, couple of weeks back, which was on September 21st. As Mitali mentioned, this election is very special because this was the first time voters went to the polling stations and voted ever since this massive economic crisis happened in Sri Lanka. So, on a largely, it's the first time where people express their will in a very explicit way using the franchise. But as we try to unpack and understand this election, I think it's crucial that we go back to understand how monumental 2022 was, which was the economic crisis that led up to this whole election. As you finally pointed out, Mitali and Ruchir, um, this election is special in many sense, especially because one of the complete outsider who managed to get only around 4 lakhs votes last time, who had only 3 seats out of 225 in the parliament, managed to get almost 4.3 to 4.4 million votes this time. And the party heads, it's quite interesting because many of the Western medias wrote it as a Marxist president has arrived in Sri Lanka. But they originally come from this party called Janakta Vimukti Peramuna, which is JVP, which had communist roots. And they had two insurrections. They were once banned as a terrorist organization, but they had a sense of revival in the past couple of decades. And in the last decade, what Andhrakumara Dissanayake has effectively done was he rebranded the political image of the party and they started this party called National People's Power, NPP. And since they started, they competed even during the last presidential election, only to get, as I already told, around 400,000 votes. But once the economic crisis hit, one of the strong point of NPP was they have always done the opposition politics very carefully without forming any government alliances by remaining very strongly independent, devoid of other major political parties. And they have ran on the platform of anti-corruption and on on what we can call it as also good governance. As we saw, like sometimes people wake up late to some of these messages, right? So when there was this overwhelming majority that came and voted for Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who ran on the national security platform in 2019, and don't forget that he got 6.9 million votes, which is huge in Sri Lanka, right? And being the brother of the former president, being the former defense secretary, there was a similar sense of excitement that we saw this time as well, right? But that was an excitement but the difference was in 2019, that campaign was all about the majoritarian single Buddhist ideology and how I am all like Gotabaya Rajapaksa ran in a platform that I'm almost like your king. I'm going to save you, right? I'm going to be a savior. Interestingly, Andhrakumar Dissanayake, and like it's one of the few campaigns in Sri Lankan history who did not really play the race or religious card as he ran this time. All he did was the former parties really screwed you up. The former regime really did not help Sri Lankan people. But I'm here to promise you, I don't want you to use the ethnic or religious card to win your votes. But I promise you, I'll root out corruption, I'll root out these inefficiencies, and we will implement policies that are common man friendly. And some of these messages were not really heard before in Sri Lankan political terrain, which explains, and especially I'll just quickly wrap up this point. The rise of Andhrakumara Dissanayake it already started, but it really took off since the economic crisis. What they did was they really started mobilizing people on the grassroots level and they did door to door campaigning in most parts of Sri Lanka, saying what would their difference be. And they did not do it just 3 months before the election. Ever since the economic crisis happened, for the last 2 years, they have been steadily building that base. And that's what we saw as this upsetting, complete outsider going to the helm of presidency in Sri Lanka. I'm sorry, I was a bit long, but I would be more than happy to.
No, it was fabulous in terms of setting the context. I wanted to discuss. Actually, I have many questions, but I'll focus on the economy because that's what all of us heard about in terms of Sri Lanka's debt levels, then tax cuts, then COVID, and then the agricultural imports or the ban on importing chemical fertilizers and so on, and what led to the now what we know as the 22 debt crisis. Um, wasn't Wikramasinghe considered really good in terms of austerity? Like, was there I believe he increased VAT. He reduced government spending. There were he offered stability because of how crazy things were, especially around electricity for a while, currency. So like it felt like Sri Lanka had a little bit of stability the last 2 years. So can you explain this from an incumbency perspective? Like, what was the mood around the current president? Like, why did the current president lose? Because from the outside, it looked like he offered stability relative to the economic situation 2 years ago.
Like, fascinating question, because this is a question the country has largely been asking, right? And as Mitali also finally pointed out earlier, this is the first time we went to the second round voting. All this time, it has been major race between two dominant candidates. But this time, there was former President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Then there was the opposition leader Sajith Premadasa, and then Andrakumara Dissanayake, who was the head of NPP. If I can really sum it up, one of the reasons why people rejected Ranil Wickremesinghe, or why he only ended up getting 2.2 million votes, was people, although he was able to bring in some sort of stability, he was able to implement austerity measures, he was able to introduce some forms of reforms, but people very much called or saw him as an old guard who belonged to the political class that has brought the country to this standstill, to the bankruptcy, and to the economic turmoil. And it is also telling why people rejected Ranil Wickremesinghe, the former president, was also because he was seen as the savior of Rajapakshas who were instrumental in creating this economic chaos. That is, like, he became the prime minister, he ascended to the presidency, and while he implemented all these measures, he effectively shielded the Rajapakshas or the Rajapaksa family or even the parliamentarians who have contributed to these policies that you mentioned earlier with zero accountability. And this is why Andrakumar Disanaike's case, AKD's case, is quite interesting, because one of his main talking point right throughout campaign was they didn't call him Ranil Wickremesinghe, they called him Ranil Rajapaksa. And they completely shifted the mode of the nation towards him, saying, all these are basics. Giving you gas, giving you electricity, giving you basic things. This is what politicians ought to do. This is not some sort of economic miracle. And don't let them convince you with the basics. And that was their effective message. And that is one of the reasons why people said, yes, we are thankful for you that you stepped up and gave us stability, but we want a completely new political culture. So I think one of the important thing that was on the ballot this time, although the Ranil Wickremesinghe camp was trying to make it a referendum on stability, but people took it as a referendum on political culture and what was there earlier and what they were aspiring to see in the future.
Um, I have so many questions as well about the economic side of things, particularly because of, the new contours of what's been signed with the IMF, what that means for the average citizen. But I'm really fascinated by the picture that you paint. Benislos of Dissanayake of AKD, as you very helpfully shared that acronym of his name with us. Who tell us a little bit about the person behind this, because it's not apples to apples, but I'm thinking about someone like Keir Starmer in the UK government, which is, it existed, the Labour Party, for and has for centuries now. But just the way he sort of was constantly criticized for not being a good enough speaker, but what he was a really, really good organizer, and he was really able to rebuild the party ground up, including making some really tough decisions. And even with Dissanayake, it's quite interesting the decisions he's made. He's chosen to dissolve the parliament. He's, appointed someone like Harini Amarasuriya, she's known to be a human rights activist. It's obviously also a sort of a strong female voice to have as the prime minister. What do we know about who Dissanayake is, how he thinks?
That's a very interesting question. I think the large part of Sri Lanka or Sri Lankans are also trying to understand and answer the question as they go on. I'm no economist, but uh, I'll try to explain it from the way I see it. Um, as someone who has been an observer of politics and a student of politics for the past decade, one thing I would say is AKD as an administrator, AKD in an executive position is almost like a myth in the sense of like people don't know it yet because large part of AKD's image has been who was a vocal advocate or who was a vocal opponent against the ruling party in the last two governments, right? Although they campaigned hard um, against some of the austerity measures, and they campaigned hard saying that some of these measures are against the common man. But surprisingly, in the last 2 weeks since he was coming to power, they've largely held together or sustained the decisions that were made by Ranil Wickremesinghe. For example, continuing with the IMF talks, large part of the Ranil Wickremesinghe camp's campaign was if anybody else get elected, they are going to discontinue it. You're going to stay in line. That is also why he used the symbol of gas cylinder as for his independent platform in which he ran on, right? To remind people that those struggles. But from the way I've been trying to talk about who it is to my friends and to a couple of people who share the same interest, I think people see him as a pragmatist, although they campaigned hard against some of the former president's policies, but they see him as a pragmatist. At no cost, they want to fail. Especially, they know that if they fail, people are not going to trust a third party one more time. And they are taking this slowly but steadily because NPP, which is AKD's party, they want to get a clear majority in the parliament. They would definitely aim for two-thirds, if not at least a simple majority. If not, governance or a hang parliament is going to be extremely difficult in that sense. So each of the steps that they have been taking, it signals um, pragmatism from AKD's end. And one of the thing that you said, right? Um, how do you measure who AKD as a leader, right? I think one of the example I would tell is like when they got two seats in parliament last time through election, they got one nationalist, which is almost like a bonus seat. And the pragmatic vision was in order to capture the women's and the educated crowd's vote. And Sri Lanka, education is an easy campaign promise. Bringing in educational people in the forefront of the government is something that wins votes all throughout Sri Lanka. And the way they brought in Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, who is largely an academic, who worked on the educational reforms, a human rights activism, who is very well known in the civil society, bringing her in was one of the pragmatic steps that they have taken to effectively mobilize the women votes. Because I still remember the moment she was brought into the parliament, many of the women were really activated and recharged, and they wanted to support in that process. So that is one simple example. Usually, like this sort of pragmatism is not commonly seen with established parties, right? Old guards would want to try to get into the contours of power when there's a bonus seat. So that's one thing. And I think during the last two governments, they largely remained independent without aligning with any of the ruling parties, which also showcases pragmatism from their side. But on a larger sense, who AKD as a leader is yet to be seen. But the last 2 weeks show that he's pragmatist, he's taking it slow, and his messaging has been, even those who didn't vote for us, we are going to make sure that we're going to work for you, which is a complete contrast from the former president's message. He said, others didn't vote for me. You are not my problem. I'm going to serve those who voted for me. So I think they're taking a very pragmatic approach. They want to win the votes of the minorities. And I think this was also signaled very clearly in his acceptance speech as a president. So while a large part of who he is yet to be seen, I think that sort of pragmatism has already been established through some of the recent appointments as well as some of the decisions they've made.
It's always wonderful, isn't it, to see elections like this. This is how we felt when Kejriwal was elected. I really hope this turns out much better than Kejriwal. Um, but like a practical question, as this is called the India dialogue, is to think about like how does this fit into India's future and Sri Lanka's future in the region. I'd love to hear your thoughts, if any, on the play of foreign policy during the elections, and whether there is a mood in Sri Lanka, especially around, I suppose, the political sandwich of China and India. We know about Haban Tota and like China's interest and desire to create a pearl necklace around India, and then obviously India has been a very, very old friend of Sri Lanka's and vice versa. So India obviously wants to have a much stronger relationship with Sri Lanka. Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like whether foreign policy was discussed during the election, and if you have a view of where does AKD stand, especially in relation to India.
I actually thought when AKD got elected, I had the same sentiment as yours. It sounded very similar to Kejriwal when he won the first time, and there was this Vice News
Call us,
documentary that I saw
Benislos,
about
call
him,
us
and
in a year. Like if you have angst, just call us. This anti-corruption is very important. We've been hearing it. No, please go on.
uh, sure. So it is quite an important question because how AKD will manage the relationships not only between India and China, but also with the United States. One of the common thing that was echoed right throughout the political circles as well as the diplomatic circles in Sri Lanka was that a lot of European and the American allies were uh, quite unsettled at his meteoric rise, and um, with which was surprising for many, or many people didn't see it coming. But again, I'll go back to the point I made earlier because as we speak, Indian Foreign Minister Mr. Jaishankar is in Sri Lanka meeting with the Prime Minister, President, the opposition leader, and important political figures in Sri Lanka. But I think AKD, while he was campaigning, while he was preparing for the presidency, he visited India like some times back. And it created this mood among the public that he is someone who wants to reach out and work with allies, who doesn't want to make the mistakes Rajpaksas did, which is to only side with one global power, which was overwhelmingly China. And also, immediately, one thing that is quite favorable for AKD as he starts to rebuild some of this, as he starts to build some of these relationships with some of these powers, is also because the former president, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, is quite very well known as someone who was a very abled foreign policy wizard who was able to work with multiple allies without alienating anyone. So, as Sri Lanka and India comes from a very strong tradition of non-alignment, I think, and also from the recent statements that the government has made, the interim cabinet has made, and also the recent signaling that they have been doing during the campaign, or as soon as they took over, is that they don't want to antagonize any powers, but they want to work hand in hand, prioritizing the national interest for sure, but to work hand in hand with both India and China as well as the United States. Again, this is yet to be seen because one of the things that is also heavily seen is India's playing a very influential role as the parliamentary elections are approaching, influencing in the north of Sri Lanka uh, and also the east of Sri Lanka, which is where the Tamil Muslim politics also takes place quite a lot. So that is also, as well as the Indian Tamils or the Malayalam Tamils who are in Sri Lanka, who also has who are also heavily influenced by the Indian actors as well. So I think time will answer it probably, but they have been taking slow but steady steps, and it doesn't signal a, an overwhelming alignment with one of the powers. So I hope that they can maintain the neutrality while prioritizing the national interest.
It is interesting though, Benislos, that that AKD himself has chosen India, as I understand, as his first foreign visit. So he's kind of, made that quite clear in terms of what his first visit will be. And correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of historically, it is a party that was quite vehemently anti-India. It's also sort of a reflection, I think, of the sentiment that many other neighbors in India have been feeling. You've probably seen what Bangladesh is going through, and comments from Muhammad Yunus saying, we would like to be for India to treat us on parity. We're both in dialogue. There's no sort of, you know as you said, there has been in India a foreign policy approach that has been quite macho in quotes, which is the big brother syndrome, which is that this used to be an Akhand Bharat, everybody used to be part of India, we're going to tell you like it is, which has frankly made a lot of our neighbors quite uncomfortable, whether it's Bangladesh or Nepal. How do you think that's going to be navigated, considering the fact, as you said, that the opening shots have been really warm? AKD is choosing to fly to India as his first foreign visit. So it looks like, they're starting off on a very high note. But I guess the crude part of my question is, how long will the high note last? Or do you think this is sort of a conscious decision?
Um, I perfectly understand what you said, right? Like in the sense of this sentiment is not just, it's also shared on a large part in Sri Lanka as well. And sometimes the big brother syndrome is not something people are very comfortable with. And especially although like in landmass and also in population we are small, but people are like treat us as equals, not as somebody inferior. That sentiment has been there, and that was very much felt during the um, past years. But also, it is to be appreciated that when the economic crisis happened, while a lot of countries wanted to renegotiate the deals and to see India extended its hands to Sri Lanka, um, and there was a huge gesture of confidence and also support, which Sri Lankans are grateful for. And I don't think we should not ignore it. That sort of immediate help, how, and they pumped multiple, if I'm not mistaken, multiple billions of dollars, right? But that is to be checked again. Um, as you said, in Sri Lanka, there's always, so when we did the foreign policy class, the first line in Sri Lankan foreign policy they teach is India is your big neighbor, right? And every other policy lines you have to remember what the first line is. This is what they said when I was studying the international relations during the university time. So I think whether we like it or not, India is a dominant power. Um, I'm not too sure how this big brother sentiment feels, but this dominant power who is also our neighbor. And I think the relationship with India is crucial as we try to navigate um, the economic situation that we are in, as we navigate the political situation that we are in. And also, the Indian alliance is quite important because a lot of minorities also try to build alliances with India, and Sri Lanka is still answerable in the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The resolutions are still ongoing, and there's a huge uh, bond that's shared between South India and north of Sri Lanka, the Tamil belt. So many of these factors play a part in how people perceive the Indian relationship, what the Indian relationship is. And I think, honestly, this is one of those elections where calling someone a Western ally or Western spy or a double agent did not play a big role because people were extremely focused on the local issues. They wanted solutions for this economic crisis. They wanted solution for the corruption, and they wanted solution for their everyday struggle. So the foreign policy wasn't much of a talking point. Um, but I hope the current administration would not in spirit, if you ask me, I would say Sri Lanka should continue to maintain the non-alignment tradition that we work with everyone, right? We don't want to be dictated whom we should work with, but we want to work with everyone kind of tradition. But I hope that they continue to follow it. And there's a clear signal, as you told from AKD, that choosing to visit India as the first official foreign visit sends a very loud and clear message to the international community as well, where Sri Lankan foreign policy priorities are and how we choose to move forward with the um, dominant neighbor.
I have one question around the identity politics part of it. You said AKD was important to remove the identity part. I'm curious about where the Tamil identity sits in the Sri Lankan ecosystem. It's been a long time since the civil war, and um, like I'm just like wondering what the temperature on the ground is, especially around ethnic Tamils in Sri Lanka. I'd love to hear from you about that.
For sure. As you would have seen, this is the first time, although there have been Tamil candidates who ran in the previous elections, but this is one of the first times they brought in a Tamil common candidate and they fielded him. And he ended up winning almost 226,000 votes. The reason why I'm telling this is although they were aiming for 1 million votes, it's only 25% of it. But 225,000 votes is not a small number of votes in the Sri Lankan context. This also sends a very clear message to the majority politics that we have every presidential election, one after the other. We tried to work with you, but all that remained was disappointment, right? Because for the last 20 years, there has always been a Rajapaksa who was on the ballot, right? But this is the first time. Yes, this time the former president's son was on the ballot, but he wasn't a significant threat for any candidate. So he wasn't a significant. He didn't have a significant vote bank or an appeal. But still, Tamils came out and said, "We are voting for the Tamil common candidate. We know we are not going to win. This is a clear message saying we are tired of this political culture. We are tired of being continuously victimized, And we are tired of all these policies where we are still treated as second-class citizen. If you continue to do this, we will go on this path. So that was a clear message that is sent out. There is currently a different mood that could be felt in the North and East. Having visited right after elections in the North and East, and I myself coming from the North, I can tell you one thing. Tamils are also really warming up to the idea of embracing outsiders or embracing or rejecting the old guard, saying for far too long that you've been talking about Tamil nationalism, but people are still struggling. 15 years since the end of war, we still talk about accountability, but people are still starving. People are like children cannot be sent to school because of the economic conditions. We want you to come up with solutions. The talk is not enough. And that sentiment is very much palpable as the candidates are warming up to the parliamentary elections, as the Tamil representatives are warming up to it. So it's going to be a hugely important elections for a lot of questions regarding the identity politics, especially about what to redefine what Tamil nationalism is. What's going to be the Tamil's part in the national life and in the national governance, and under a new guard like AKD, will the Tamils be willing to come to the central government and take up the roles and responsibilities and to deliver economic stability for the long neglected North and East region? So these are some of the sentiments that could be felt during the presidential election and leading up to the parliamentary elections as well.
It sounds fascinating, and I know we could keep talking about it, but we don't want to sort of keep you for very long. I will say, I think it's always, as political science students or as entrepreneurs, which is what Ruchir is, or for you as a foreign policy student, it's fascinating to see a political movement grow from ground up. There's so many deep roots that political families have, and this political lineage is so well entrenched in so many economies and countries, including the US actually. But I think it's always really fabulous to see a movement which sort of grows from within the people and then takes this shape and form. So I will be watching as we have. I don't know if you know about this section, Benislos, but we call it Have You Heard, which is that all of us and our guests sort of talk about something interesting that they've seen or something interesting that they want to share. You can either go first, or if you want to watch how it moves, we can start with Ruchir and put the pressure on him, and then we can come back to you. So you get to decide.
I've always been a last bench student, so I'll go last this time.
Well played, well played, well played. Ruchir, your
you,
go.
you didn't sound like it. You sounded far more intelligent, I'll
No,
just say
exactly.
that. I often cover a range of topics. This week, my attention was caught by Facebook, who historically have not been like the first to admire as a company, but they released these augmented reality glasses called Orion. Um, and just in terms of thinking about the future of sort of human interaction with technology, glasses have looked really interesting, but because of the limitations of, well, a battery, b sort of interacting with the glass interface, and there are so many ways you can interface with it, right? Like eye tracking, gesture tracking, talking to it, listening to it, that in some ways it looks like the artificial intelligence has given Facebook a really lucky break, because especially because of being able to communicate much better with voice, these glasses might turn out to be a really practical computing interface. So I'm quite excited about wearing them. I'm looking forward to trying them on and seeing how it feels. There are all these videos about sort of walking past the restaurant and finding out more details about it, or checking a product, whether like how much sugar it has and so on and so forth. I mean, it feels quite neat. So yeah, check it out if you haven't seen the demos of Orion on the Meta website. Hopefully, at least I'll try and get my hands on it soon. That's my heavy hurt.
Very
Mitali, you
cool.
want to go next?
Benislos, do you feel ready?
Yes,
That
after you.
after me. Okay. I have a small one and a big one. So I have two. One is that I'm thinking about another tech giant, but this time Elon Musk, where there was a report shared recently. Of course, X or Twitter is no longer listed, but there was a valuation done by investment giant Fidelity that I suppose used to have, some exposure to the company, which is that at this point in time, as they value it, X or Twitter is worth 80% less than 2 years ago when Musk bought it. So their valuation is that X is around just under $9.5 billion, and Musk's purchase price, just for anyone who remembers, was $44 billion. I think honestly, as a space, as a sort of a public town square, I feel quite disillusioned about what it has degenerated into. It used to be many complicated things, but it also used to be a really thriving place for journalists and for talking about news and developments. So it's quite sad to see that. And the other one is about a dear friend, a colleague, Sukanya Shanta, who is a journalist and works with The Wire. Sukanya has been writing on prisons and the state of prisons in India for many years now, and she's done some fantastic work that has been awarded and greatly appreciated. But she took it upon herself to file a petition, which then reached the Supreme Court, essentially pointing out that there were provisions in prison manuals across states in India that were discriminating between people on the basis of caste, that there was sort of barrack segregation. They were using very vague terms and calling, those from denotified tribes as habitual offenders. And this was rampant and happening across prisons in India. Sukanya filed a PIL, or a public interest litigation. It was based on the work that she had done, and there was actually a ruling by a Supreme Court bench of the Chief Justice and two other justices saying that those provisions were unconstitutional and they had to be deconstructed and sort of just disassembled in the next 3 months. In fact, at the end of this entire ruling, Justice Chandrachud actually commended Sukanya and said it was such a fantastically constituted and written litigation, and that's how citizens can actually make change happen. So it really gave me a lot of hope and joy to see journalism in action and in motion with so much impact. That's my have you heard. Benislos, now the time is upon you.
I'll start off from having gained inspiration from what you said, Mitali. So, right before joining this, I was just finishing a written submission for a court filing. So, I was doing some legal research, and um, I think one of my favorite piece of reading is reading some of the judgments. And few of my favorite judgments are written by Indian judges. And every single time when I do the research, and when you go and read the judgments from the Sri Lankan Supreme Court, most often than not, you end up finding references to the rulings of the Indian court. And I've, as someone who loves legal literature, the nuances and the nitty-gritties of it, it just fascinates me. And I was just doing a written submission on why the domestic inquiries is crucial uh, for workmen's right, and there were some incredible judgments. And one of the other thing the first thing I had in mind to share was I recently watched this movie from South India called Mayalagan. um, this was a movie directed by this famous director who directed a movie in 2018 called 96. His name is Prem Kumar. This movie really breaks the stereotypes of this macho culture, superhuman heroes, where this is almost like uh, romance is a cheesy way of saying it. The conversation between a man who settled down in urban Chennai, who goes back to his village in Tanjavur after 20 years, and also the goodness of people who are living in the village side. So it might sound corny and stereotypical, but it's a beautiful, beautiful movie. It really broke some of the cinematic grammar that we've been seeing, where the heroes are considered to be this superhuman ability people. But this was a beautiful piece of filmmaking. Once again, Prem Kumar has produced. So, in case if you guys get a chance, I would encourage. It's a bit long, but it's worth the time. So, it's a beautiful
I have
piece of
a
film.
I have a list of South Indian movies I watch on airplanes, so this is going on the list.
And
And
I
it's
feel
going
Thank
to
so
be
you.
on
bad
Netflix.
that
So,
Manu isn't here for this conversation, because I think you would have sort of been like
Yeah, that's right.
instant friends with your interest in legal literature and Southern Indian cinema, which he loves watching as well. So
That's true.
maybe in another episode there will be space for that.
Another episode. Hopefully, a follow up in a year and see if he's delivered. That would be really good. Thank you, Benislos, for a great conversation. For us to learn more about the recent elections, especially from the ground. This was really helpful for context. This has been another episode of the India Dialogue. Thank you for making it so far. As always, you can find us on YouTube at India Dialogue Podcast, on Apple or Spotify. On Twitter, we are at TID_podcast, the India Dialogue _podcast. Mitali is at Mitali Live. Benislos is at Benislos. Ruchir at Ruchir_P. Please find us, write to us at India Dialogue Podcast at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening, and see you again soon. Bye.